Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to this webinar on assisting homeowners with Landslip EQC Claims. The webinar this morning is run by David Buxton from Northland Geotechnical Specialists. And just one comment before we start, that there's a chat box which you can put questions into, and at the end, hopefully David will have a chance to respond and answer to those questions. So thanks very much, David. Over to you.
Cool. Thanks very much, Michael. And thanks for attending this afternoon. So I've got a bit to get through. I'll try and keep it to a timely manner and allow some time for questions, so I'll get into it. So webinar today, obviously, assisting homeowners with Landslip EQC Claims. So first question, why this webinar? Well, the reality is homeowners are lay people. Very few have any idea about landslips and very few have any idea about the EQC Act. While most EQC insurance claims go fine, some do not. People make mistakes, including fellow engineers and assessors, and occasionally things get wrong or things get disputed. And I think engineers are uniquely suited to helping out. We're well placed to have a broad understanding of the process of most of the EQC landslip process. In particular, when a landslip occurs, we are there at the start to assess and advise, and we're there right until the end when the landslip is fixed, the final sign-offs are happening, so we get to see the process from start to finish and get a good understanding of that full process. So we're well suited to help owners right through that process. Why have you got me here today? Well, hopefully I've got a reasonable degree of knowledge and experience in the topic. I've had occasional people ask me for advice around this subject, and looking to them, they were keen for such a webinar. So you've got me here. My background, I spent almost 10 years with Tonkin Taylor, working in Auckland. Almost a quarter of that time was working for the Earthquake Commission, mostly on landslips, hardly any on the Christchurch earthquake. And in the last 6 or 7 years up in Whangarei, I've worked for a range of homeowners in a range of scenarios, working with landslip claims for them and working on both sides of the fence. Unfortunately, the webinar is not being run through a more official means. I really appreciate Surtex stepping up to host it. EQC did express some concerns that I could lead to some duplication or inconsistencies for the audience. So if I get things wrong or confuse you, I apologise. If I get things wrong and people want to bring it to my attention, I will do my best to correct it afterwards. EQC have released a number of training modules. They are focused for people who are writing reports for the Earthquake Commission, and they set out the basics of the EQC Act and how they go about writing the reports. They are on their Engineering New Zealand website for people who would like to do them. The Geotech Society has also asked for feedback on those training modules and indicated they'll arrange a panel or follow-up discussion with experienced Geotech Society members in this field if any responses is received. So there's another opportunity to ask questions or ask for more information about this topic. On the EQC website, you'll also find a number of resources. EQC have their claims manual. There's one for land and there's one for buildings. And they are useful things if you're looking at really specific aspects to assist people with on claims. It's also worth taking note of the EQC customer code on their website. EQC commit to answering homeowners' questions accurately in writing if requested. They commit to explaining decisions they make accurately, clearly, concisely, and effectively in their interactions with you. So if you're advising a homeowner, you can help the homeowner to ask questions to really clarify the decisions on their property, and EQC has committed to responding to those. So my aspiration and part of my reason for putting a webinar together is that I do aspire that when homeowners are affected by a natural disaster, in this case a landslide, that they can easily find an informed and capable engineer to assist them. That we can have a process where disputes or uncertainties can be resolved through collaborative means, through discussion, through mediation, through on-site meetings. That we can have a process where the homeowners are valued. After all, it's their home. They are the ones suffering the financial loss, the stress, having to make the decisions about what happens, the ones having to do the waiting. And it's easiest on the homeowner if this process demonstrates good faith. So they can mostly accept the outcome. Obviously, there's odd situations where people will struggle to do so. And part of enabling homeowners to see the process happening in good faith is them having access to advice that is informed and independent of EQC. Apologies if at times I come across as a too pessimistic or negative. Insurance disputes don't always end up being a whole lot of fun, and are unfortunately too common. Insurance and EQC staff have a tough job. Most of the time you're dealing with really good people there, but working through the issues. So a bit of reflection while I'm talking about more philosophical things. Why do we have the EQC Act, EQC, and what lens should we apply to the Act? So the EQC Act is a mix of social and financial policy. We have it to ensure a housing stock can recover after a natural disaster in a timely and effective manner. It's also used to enable us to have very high rates of natural disaster insurance at a reasonable cost, and it's very effective at doing so. But a flip side to that is that it makes insurance through EQC almost compulsory. As soon as you take out a fire insurance policy, you end up with EQC insurance coverage. It means there's not alternative policies readily available to the average homeowner. You can't choose, for example, to only insure 5 metres of land around your house or 10 metres of land. You can't choose to vary the conditions to a more favourable or less favourable condition to yourself. You're stuck with the EQC Act. Back when the EQC Act came in 1994, EQC thought through this and decided that imposed an obligation on them to interpret the Act in a broad manner. And it considered that the Act was intended to include a broad range of damage and really support anyone who is insured and affected by a natural disaster. And that's a lens I like to apply when I'm looking at the EQC Act. It's also worth noting that EQC is not spending public money, it's spending money from the Natural Disaster Fund. An insured homeowner has paid into that fund, and they are entitled to receive a settlement from that fund when they suffer loss. The fact that that fund is currently pretty low or possibly going to be exhausted by recent events is not really the concern of the homeowner. In fact, it's not the concern of the homeowner at all. It's the concern of the government, of the EQC Chief Executive Board and Minister, and it shouldn't affect the interpretation on any given site. Another key interpretation in the EQC Act that dates back from the early mid-90s period is the imminent risk aspects. So I'm sure many of you have seen reports assessing imminent risk. It has to be as a direct result of the natural disaster occurred. And it also talks about being within 1 year under normal annual rainfall conditions. Imminent risk was introduced into the Act after the Abbotsford landslide and the Royal Commission following that. Part of the problem with the Abbotsford landslide is they could see occurring gradually over time, but they didn't have the chance to respond until damage had actually occurred. So that's where we got a proactive measure in the Act with imminent risk. It is at the opinion of the Commission, so they do have discretion as to how they interpret it. It is the legal opinion they got, set a 1 year time frame, but that is still an opinion. So while it's probably pretty rigid, strictly speaking, it's not a hard and fast rule. And when making decisions on imminent risk, I often think it's useful to consider the context of why we have it, which is simply that if it makes sense to take action to prevent more damage, then that damage was probably imminent and should be included. And there's just an example, some shots of Abbotsford showing in July when they had already started tracking and observing the damage, taking photos of it, and then watching it through to August. So, what's the EQC landslip process for a homeowner? Well, obviously, first they have to have some damage occur and they have to lodge their claim. The first step when their claim is lodged and accepted is an assessor is going to come out and attends. If that assessor sees fit, based on the damage, they will then engage an engineer to complete an assessment. Once that engineer attends and produces a report, the cost estimate will cost the remedial solutions included in the engineer's report. A land valuer will be engaged to value the affected areas of land, and EQC will assess what's the lesser cost, and with respect to the land settlement, the lesser cost to repair the land or pay out on the value of the land. Similarly with dwelling damage, they'll assess that cost to repair the dwelling, and they'll pay out up to the dwelling cap. Above that, it goes back to the primary insurer, and then a payout is made. So mistakes can occur at any step of this process. So it pays to check each step has been completed fairly and well when you're asked to assist by a homeowner. So an example of this is a summary of a site I worked for, the homeowner. They noticed damage to their home and they lodged a claim. Unfortunately, they had a Section 72 notice on their title under the Building Act, and their claim was accordingly declined by EQC. On review of that Section 72 notice, it was clear that that notice did not apply to the dwelling. It applied to a slither of land, but not the dwelling. It was somewhat unusual, so that was challenged, and EQC then accepted that the claim is now valid and appointed an engineer. The engineer assessed the property and considered the damage to be settlement. So there was some more discussions, some more stress and worry from the homeowners, opinion put together, and the challenge completed. The site was revisited, and it was agreed it was a landslip. Homeowner received their payout, associated documents, and they were pretty happy at this stage. It still wasn't going to fully cover their repair costs, but much better than when they started. But I noted to them that their land valuation that formed the basis of their settlement was based on an average value, not the value of the area actually lost or damaged under the Act. They were reluctant at this stage, having a pretty hard process already, a long process already. And then they realised how much it might be worth. They decided it was worth challenging, and it was challenged. EQC redid the valuation, and they got an independent valuation, and they got an increased payout of another $100,000 or more from that. There's an example of a homeowner who was left rather shocked that actually their payout was entirely dependent on them having access to good advice at every step. Now, obviously, that's a reasonably extreme example of where it's gone multiple times and in significant ways, but it can happen, which is where we can really add value as engineers. So, where do we start with looking at EQC claims and helping people? We need to have a good knowledge of the EQC Act. It's quite an accessible document. The majority of it you can ignore, but there's a few key sections you need to know and need to know where to find them. You can find the Act online on the legislation.gov.nz website and access it fairly easily. So I'm going to run through some of the key areas now. At the start of the Act, you have the interpretations. There's a number of definitions that are critical. It lists the natural disasters that are covered. It states that it's got to be as a direct result of a natural disaster, and it includes also measures taken to mitigate that damage if they're appropriately approved. It defines what a natural landslip is, and that definition, when we're dealing with landslips, is really critical. So going through it, we've got a natural landslip means the movement whereby a way of falling, sliding, flowing, or a combination thereof. So it doesn't, it's just ground movement. Normally it's going to be horizontal and vertical ground movement together, but the first qualifying step is we have ground movement. There's got to be a ground forming materials composed of natural rock, soil, artificial fill, or a combination of such materials. So that again is really broad. It could include sawdust. It could include rubble and bricks and debris and timber. As long as it's ground forming materials that are, the things that are forming the ground, then they can be included. They've got to form an integral part of the ground. And then there's a list of exclusions, which is a movement due to below ground subsidence, soil expansion, soil shrinkage, soil compaction, and erosion. So if you come across a site that's affected by ground movement, it's more than likely going to be a landslip, unless it is actually caused by one of those exclusions. It's also worth noting that the term subsidence here is used for vertical mechanisms. We're talking mine collapse, we're talking limestone sinkholes, we're talking specific vertical mechanisms. It's not another mechanism where you can say something is a landslip by another name and say it's not a natural landslip in the Act. It has to be applied fairly strictly. It's also worth noting that despite it being called a natural landslip in the Act, there's nowhere in there that it says it has to occur by natural causes. It doesn't specifically state how it has to occur or limit how it occurs. Just the occurrence is what's triggered there. And the definition of physical loss or damage is where we get the definition of imminent risk, which we already covered prior. We also have define what a residential building means. It's worth noting that a residential building can be part of a building. So if you have a building where only part of it is residential and the majority is commercial or industrial or other things, you can keep looking at smaller and smaller parts of that building until you get 50% of a small part that is residential, and then that can become a residential part of a building. I've got our pertinent structures, and it's also worth noting that water supply services, drainage, sewage, gas, electrical, telephone services are part of the definition of a residential building. It means the repair of those comes under the building cap. Although I do note that land within 8 metres of those is not insured. It has to be the actual buildings and appurtenant structures. Under Part D, it's also worth noting that they have to be within 60 metres of horizontal line, and they have to be owned by the owner of the dwelling or building or part. But it doesn't anywhere say that they have to be within the property boundary. That's something I've seen suggested that they do have to be. It doesn't say in the Act that they do, so I'm not 100% sure the interpretation of that is at the moment, but it's certainly in the Act doesn't say they have to be within the boundary. Likewise, we've got a definition of residential land, which hopefully you're all somewhat familiar with. Go through the EQC training modules if you want to get more familiar with it. So the key one is our 8 metres for around the buildings and the pertinent structures, 60 metres of the main access way. Sometimes there can be more than one main access way if we've got more than one structure. And also it's land within 60 metres and supporting that as well. We've got bridges and culverts within insured land areas. Note they have to be fully within insured land areas. Last time I was aware of it. So a bridge that's half in and half outside the boundary would not be insured. And I assume that's still the case, but I haven't dealt with it in recent times. And again, retaining walls need to support insured land. So if it's a 2 metre high retaining wall, 9 metres from a building, it's likely supporting land within 8 metres, so it's likely insured, even though it's just outside that 8 metres. Parts 3 to 18 of the Act, you can skip. Section 19 sets out the land cap for the land, and so that's where we get the value of land paid out is limited to the value of a minimum sized lot, or the value of 4,000 square metres if it's or the value of a minimum sized lot in district plan, or the area of land that's actually lost or damaged, and that sets our land cap. It's also noted that because bridges and culverts and retaining walls are included as part of land, they also have a value, and the value here is indemnity, not replacement, so depreciated value. And that is additional to the value of the minimum size lot. Skipping forward through a bit more, we also have something called a Section 28 notice under the EQC Act, and that is a lot like a Building Act Section 72 notice, where notice is put on the certificate of title, limiting future natural disaster insurance coverage. That is normally after a property has been effectively written off or very severely affected. Like you can get a Section 72 notice off by stabilising the site to satisfaction of your local council. You can also get a Section 28 notice taken off the site by satisfying EQC the property has been appropriately repaired. Section 29, settlement of claims. It makes clear that EQC does have discretion to settle claims by payment, by replacement, or reinstatement at their option. At the back of the Act, we've got some schedules. Schedule 2 is useful because it tells us what's not insured, which is always useful to know. It's reasonably self-explanatory. Just be careful to read it in enough detail. I have seen at times people suggest that a tank is not insured because it's excluded. You need to read down and note that a water tank forming part of the water supply to a residential building is insured. Likewise, a swimming pool is typically not insured, but a swimming pool that constitutes an integral part of the residential building does become insured. That is there and pretty straightforward to pull out and look at. Another key part when you're helping people is Schedule 3, Part 3, which is circumstances where EQC may decline claims. And I'll come back to that. Also in Schedule 3 is the reporting of claims. Now, this is not as critical as it once was. Until a couple of years back, you had to lodge an EQC claim within 28 days of the damage occurring, and EQC had discretion up to 3 months' time. And there were people that missed out on significant Landslip claims because they lodged it more than 3 months late, and EQC just had no discretion. Now you have up to 3 months to lodge a claim, and that can be extended out to 2 years or possibly longer, as long as EQC is not significantly disadvantaged from that process. So that's not something you come across as much anymore, but still occasionally could. And some other bits in there is, the rights to salvage, the replacement of building. The fact that EQC on a large rural site, it might make sense to relocate a building to a stable spot, fixing a landslide, and that's a valid settlement mechanism. There's also something called subrogation of rights, which is that EQC can take over the rights to seek recovery from another party. So if a landslip is caused by an obvious action by another party, it is still considered a natural landslip under the EQC Act. And EQC should still look after the homeowner in the same way as a truly natural landslip, and EQC takes over the rights to seek recovery once they're paid out. The EQC has moved to the new model, the natural disaster recovery model, where it's partnered with private insurers. So now primary insurers take the lead and do work on most EQC claims. Occasionally, they still need to defer to EQC and ask EQC questions because EQC does have discretion on a number of matters. A lot of insurers and their staff are, learning and getting up to speed on landslips and land for the first time. It is something that takes a bit of getting used to for people new to it. And as I work through, I'm using the term EQC as a general term for insurers, and noting that EQC is now Taupatu Ake EQC. So now we know the key bits. The Act will loop back out of the assessment and settlement process and just look at some things we need to watch out for when we're helping property owners. Now, when the assessors attend, they sometimes decline the claims at that stage, and there's a couple of things if that happens it's worth checking. So the first one is a Section 72 notice. So how do we review that? So if a customer's claim is declined under a Section 72 notice, it's worth getting their property title and pulling up that notice, and it's also worth obtaining the council property file. Now, the property title should give some basic information. Normally it's just the date it was issued. Sometimes it includes more information. From the property file, you can match the building consent that is from the same date as the Section 72 notice, and you can see why it was placed. Sometimes there's good information, sometimes there's very little. But for example, if it applied to a shed that was built 20 metres away from the house out the back, and the house was already existing prior, the house wasn't granted under a Section 72, and the landslip affects the house, despite there being a Section 72 notice on the title, it would still seem appropriate to pay out on the house because that clearly Section 72 relates to the garage. Likewise, it might have been placed there for flooding, but you're dealing with a landslip. And so if it is declined, it's sometimes worth going back and asking EQC to have another look if it's not relevant. And another issue at this stage can be the damage date. Some people put in what I'd consider a retrospective damage date. It's less common now, the changes, but an example of this is, say, someone had damage occurring to the house, say between the 1st of January next year and 25th of February, started off notable but not enough to trigger any action. By 25th February, it's sufficiently bad they lodge a claim. They lodge a claim, they're asked when the damage occurred. In hindsight, they think back and they want to be fully honest and transparent because you've got to be with your insurer. They don't want to lie and they do want to be genuine. They remember they'd noticed a small crack on the wall back in 2019. They didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't take much notice of it, but they're being fully transparent and honest. So they give the first date of damage as 2019. That could then lead to the claim being declined because it hasn't been lodged within time the claim needs to be lodged. Given the actual consequential damage has occurred just before they've lodged the claim, that would be worth going back to EQC and asking them to have another look at, because it seems not appropriate to decline. It's just that the people have not understood what actually they've been asked for a damage date there. The next step of the process is going to be the engineer attends and produces their report. Hopefully many of us are familiar with an EQC assessment report, and this is obviously a core part of our field. When you're reviewing someone else's report for your homeowner, it is just a thorough review of that report. You need to check that the engineer's noted all the damage. You need to check that what the homeowner tells you aligns with how they've presented it in their report. If the engineer's concluded it's not a landslip, their report should be clear on why they've reached this conclusion, and you can make your own independent assessment based on the definition of a landslip. They need to check that they've mapped the damage correctly, that they haven't missed a scarp or another area of damage. Check that their site plan, they've measured the land areas correctly, because that ultimately affects the land valuation of which payouts are often based. Check that conceptual remedial solution is appropriate. Check the professional fees are suitable. In short, a really thorough check. And often in this situation, the engineer engaged by EQC, it's another job. They're doing many of them. They might have been doing 4 or 5 assessments that day sometimes. But for the homeowner, it is the one report that matters to them. So it needs to be correct and it needs to be accurate. When you're working for the homeowner, normally you have the ability to be a bit more thorough than EQC's engineers. You've got the time to take a good review. Often it's easier for you to go back to site and check on things if needed, and it allows you to do a really good job and really give them the confidence that their report that's been relying on for their settlement claim is thorough and appropriate. Comment on remedial solutions. This is a simplified version of one I saw recently, but I was pretty disappointed to see another engineer suggesting was appropriate. They're suggesting that, for a start, it's a bit of a guess. The landslip was 5.8 metres, but that's where their section showed it. They were suggesting a 7.2 metre long timber pole was big enough to hold up that landslip, which it clearly wasn't, and clearly wasn't credible. And it's disappointing to see that in a report. The sort of thing that we need to push back on fellow engineers and let them know to do a better job when we see things such as this. Likewise, some fees in a report. On the left here, we've got some estimated fees out of a report from a couple of years ago. It's a job that completed for the homeowner in the real world, and the real world fees and investigation costs, the drillers, the CPTs, the test pits, consent fees, PS4, everything was about 70,000. So this was a pretty good estimate. Recently, I've seen some other fees that are suggesting that it's a grunty landslip. It needs an inclinometer and piezometer. So we're spending $22,000 on our drillers and CPTs and things. But it's suggesting the engineer can oversee those investigations, complete the design and prepare drawings for $3,500. Suggests we don't need a site survey from which to base the drawings on, suggesting that the building consent's only going to be $2,000, which would be a pretty simple consent for many councils. And it's suggesting that we can drill piles, probably put a capping beam, some steel, maybe some anchors, and all the construction monitoring, construction management, etc., for just $1,000. What's more, it's a fairly remote site. So it's about a 2.5 hour round trip from the nearest geotech engineer to actually be able to engage for these things. So I'm not sure how many of you here would be volunteering to take on that job. And again, I see it's disappointing that people aren't putting realistic costs in their reports. And for those people doing them, I really encourage to take some time to consider what it does actually take to do these jobs. These landslips sometimes are quite complex. It takes a bit of thinking, working through. It takes time with the homeowner to figure out what the best option is. It does need to be supervised properly when it's under construction, and it does cost quite a bit. Part 3, Schedule 3, gives us areas where claim declines can happen. It's often at the the engineering assessment stage, and these reasons are unrepaired damage, failure to comply with the law, not constructed to the standard of the day, Section 72 notice on the title, misrepresentation, fraud, or a willful act that's contributed. Conversely to those, because they've occurred does not mean EQC has to decline the claim. It says it may decline or meet part only. So you can have these circumstances occur and it can still be appropriate for the claim to be paid. EQC does have discretion and it should use that discretion in a suitable manner. And because there's unrepaired damage doesn't mean the claim is automatically declined as well. The unrepaired damage needs to have contributed. There needs to be a link between the previous unrepaired damage that EQC's paid out on and the recent damage. Likewise, the failure to comply with the law needs to be relevant. The failure has to cause or exacerbate the new damage. It's not built to the standard again for the day. Again, that has to be a relevant cause or contribution to the damage. Covered Section 72 refers to fraud, and a willful act. If it's a willful act by the insured person, it needs to be a relevant willful act. If it's a willful act by a past owner, and it's reasonable to hope that the current owner was aware of that past willful act before that's actually enacted to decline a claim. And as part of assisting someone recently, obtained through Official Information Act request a checklist that EQC's had for many years. I'm not sure how actively they're currently using it. In the example I saw, they hadn't used it, but it really simply sets out some relevant grounds that should be used if a claim is declined under Part 3, and I think it's a really good explanation of things that EQC at least once considered relevant, and I hope still considered to be relevant. Looking at an example in more detail, say someone has built an accessway that's insured with 2 retaining walls and it suffers damage from a landslide, like we've got on the left. Imagine that landslide actually goes right under both of those things. So despite those retaining walls maybe not being built to code, or maybe not consented when they should have been, they would still be insured and should still be covered unless the construction of those caused or exacerbated that landslip. And as I've drawn it there, I don't think they would have. Or, even if it did cause or exacerbate it, it would be relevant if a person building it had told them that it was built to code, that they didn't need consents or other things. Those issues should be taken into account and discussed. And as engineers help homeowners in these situations, part of our role is to make sure and help the homeowner ensure those things have been considered. So once the engineer assessment is complete and satisfactory, the cost estimate produces costing of a remedial solution. Some of you will have better ability to produce your own cost estimates. For some, you're not going to have the information to do so. But regardless, you should be aware that cost estimates do not have to assume the homeowner has to do the repairs on the cheap. The scope should allow for a quality contractor to actually complete the full scope of works. Likewise, the cost estimate should allow for all consent and professional fees. If a building damage needs a structural engineer or other design to help fix consents, that shouldn't be left out. Often the reports are focusing on the land damage and sometimes can forget those costs within the building damage as well. Noting the land and building components come under separate caps, so they need to be costed separately. If you're looking at cost estimates, it's always worth having done an insurance job with a really high-end property where they set really high standards, and you see what standards they insist for their repair. And I think the average homeowner should also be able to insist for a high standard of repair to their property. The land value is going to value the affected land area. Now, obviously, we're not land valuers, so we can't give specific land valuation advice, but we can still have an understanding of this process in a way that enables us to steer the customers in the right direction. Why does this matter? Well, a few years ago, I had a client who was underpaid over $100,000 because the valuation wasn't done quite correctly. Not long after, I had someone who got $65,000, but I suspect they're probably actually only due about $15,000 because of the way their land was incorrectly valued. I believe EQC have stopped using desktop valuations, and I believe they have improved their processes quite a bit. But there's possibly a few claims over the last few years where people have been shortchanged. So engineers, what do we need to know? Well, the basic simple concept is land is valued for what it is. So if we have a house here with a steep gully to the side, we could have a big landslide on the steep gully to the side. If we imagine this property without this gully area, it would be worth almost as much. This area of their land, even though it's big, is not worth much. So it's given a low land area a value and a low claim payout. Whereas if we have this red landslide to the other side, that's affecting the dwelling. It's affecting the parking driveway area. It's affecting the really key parts of the site. Without these, the site doesn't have much value. So even though it's a small area, it's going to be a much higher area of land. So the bits we need to look at is to make sure that the land valuation reflects the area is lost. If we know a key area of land has been lost, the value should be high. If it's a steep bank at the back, the value should be low. So understanding that, one can help the customer understand the basis for their payout, but also we can help steer them to a land value or suggest they get a land valuer to get independent advice on this. And if it's a significant claim, land valuations are open to interpretation. Not every value is going to give exactly the same cost. So sometimes it's worth a homeowner getting an independent valuation, just because the difference between a couple of valuers, both doing a good job, both doing it correctly, maybe in the tens of thousands of dollars. So it's sometimes worth doing regardless. I have asked EQC about that. They didn't respond that they confidently knew people didn't get shortchanged other people, but have noted that customers can always come back to them and request a review of their settlement. I'd like to think it's not reliant on customers to pick up their problems. Need to be aware that EQC payout has two parts, and they are effectively assessed quite separately and then added together. Building payout is the repair cost limited by the cap in the EQC Act. Currently $300,000 for most people, although for some recent claims, they may still be at $150,000 cap, depending on when their insurance policy renewed for the first time after the 1st of October last year. You need to be aware that you can get a full building payout, but only a partial land payout. Or you can have a dwelling that is really badly damaged, a landslip right through the middle, effectively destroying it. That landslip doesn't affect the full section. So even though they're getting fully paid out on the house, they're only getting half paid out on the land. You can get the opposite. You can get a full payout on the land, the whole land area is affected, but the house may be relatively undamaged, sitting in the middle of a landslip. So you're not going to get much building payout. This can leave people well short of what they might have expected to, not having known what EQC does and doesn't cover, especially if those landslips cannot be fixed. Then people are left effectively with a stranded, devalued asset that they can't fix, and it makes them pretty hard to move on. So we have pretty bitter experience, but it is how the Act works. So sometimes we need to be the ones to explain this and really let bad news to the homeowner sink in when situations occur. So yes, unfair can be correct under the EQC Act. It can be our job to explain the bad news. This diagram is one I used when I submitted to the Natural Hazards Insurance Bill last year. I put a link there that discusses it, but I went through a number of scenarios where people do get, I think, a pretty rough end of the deal under the EQC Act, but that is what the current Act is. In terms of helping owners with remedial solutions, people often assume they have to do the solution that EQC has assessed, which is the concept solution in the engineer's report. That's not correct. Still, the time they will be cash settled, and they can choose what solution is best for them. The key things to note are that in the most significant events, the Section 28 notice may have been lodged on their title, and then that means they won't have coverage unless it is repaired to the satisfaction of the Commission, and they go back to the Commission and have that removed. In most claims, that doesn't get lodged. In most claims, the Commission relies on Schedule 3, Part 3A, which allows them to decline a claim of the natural disaster damage to which the claim relates was caused or exacerbated by earlier natural disaster damage for which the Commission made a payment, and that payment was not used to repair the property. So normally in the engineer's report for EQC, the concept solution will have a retaining wall 8 metres from the house. There's nothing stopping you putting actual retaining wall 2 or 3 metres from the house. You just need to be aware that that land from that 2 or 3 metres distance out to the 8 metre land is unlikely to be paid out again by EQC because you haven't protected it. But instead, as long as that wall is designed properly and appropriately, it should reinstate insurance coverage upside of that wall. We just need to make sure we clear that with our customers and clear as we work through what's the best option for their site. Remember, residential video works should be low risk. It's pretty sad when you see people having to fix things the same thing twice, and it's not fun. Despite investigations being expensive on residential sites, we still need to do them properly. And remember, deflections matter. For larger, deeper landslips, this often requires anchors. At the extreme end, I've seen a house that had 900 diameter piles at about 2.5 metre centres in a row in front of it. They went down 18 metres, and those piles, despite not reaching their structural capacity, had already moved about 100 mil, so clearly hadn't done the job, which was really unfortunate for that homeowner. We don't need to be overly sceptical of damage, particularly when a big event has occurred. This is from an insurance assessor's report from a home, and they're suggesting that this electrical cable up to the switchboard for the house was out of alignment as a pre-existing thing. It's pretty disappointing to see because what has actually happened is the main scout goes under this dwelling. The whole dwelling has moved down slightly by about 100 mil, but the cable at the ground level hasn't, which is why it's on this big kink. This is actually a sign of a significant landslip deformation. So where we see it, push back where people are being overly sceptical. Through the whole process, EQC should be communicating. Fair Insurance Code indicates EQC should be communicating to the customer every 20 days. So hopefully they are being kept up to date. Unfortunately, my view is recent times is EQC is a bigger organisation that aspires to less. And why do I say that? Well, a range of things. One is when I first started work for Tonkin Taylor, the very first time I went out with a drill rig was on an EQC landslide site up in Kerikeri. I wasn't logging it, I was tagging along with the geologist to learn and understand how to do this. EQC saw fit to invest in training people like myself on EQC sites to gather the knowledge so we could contribute to future natural disaster events and could do things like running a webinar today. It's something I don't see EQC doing anymore. The fact that we're there drilling a borehole is a rare occurrence these days. And this is particularly apparent on multi-property landslip events. A couple of years ago, Rebecca and I helped out with one in Whangarei for the homeowners. These homeowners basically just got a cash settlement, I think about 9 months after the event occurred. It occurred across 6 properties, and they were in various different states. Some of those homeowners were getting partial payouts. It didn't enable them to abandon and walk away. It was going to be really tough if that landslip couldn't repair. Others had to make the decision to repair or walk away. So it's really critical that we knew how deep that landslide was and what it would take to fix. Unfortunately, a report had been done on this for EQC, but they guessed the depth of failure, and in fact, they were out by a factor of 2.5 times. If it was me on a landslip and I had the full choice, what I think we should aspire to is we should be investigating those sites. And the best time to investigate them is up front, so we can get some kilometres in, we can monitor, we can confirm the depth, and that insurance assessment approach can be based on real data and real knowledge. So if it can be fixed, it can be coordinated. I can tell you, working for a group of 6 homeowners, even though a fantastic group of 6, was pretty tough as a self-employed independent engineer, and it really, really relies on a lot of goodwill and a lot of people, and I think that's something that should be done up front. It was once standard, it was once common. Investigations used to happen, not on every site, but the ones where it mattered. And unfortunately, insurers tell me that EQC has advised investigations just aren't funded by EQC anymore. So I can only see that EQC is aspiring to less, and I think less than we would expect from them. On that theme, if you're assessing stuff for the insurers in EQC, I think there are situations where you are just guessing the depth of a landslide. You are just guessing what it would take to fix. And I think where that truly matters, where it matters if you overkill it, matters if you underdo it, I think it becomes borderline unethical for us to start guessing. And I think there's places where engineers need to push back and say that some investigations really are needed to inform that insurance settlement in that process. Sometimes you get into places where the main thing you've got to go on is the homeowner's observations. The whole claim or parts of the claim hang on that. There's some useful case law. This one out of a Christchurch earthquake, where EQC and Southern Response didn't suggest the homeowners were manufacturing or lying, but they had a mistaken impression of what the house was like before or after. This can occur. I've clearly seen people who have had misheld views of what the damage has occurred. But that doesn't mean we can dismiss everyone. Despite this, people's observations are still critical. This is a really good example because in this case, the judge believed the homeowners over the number of experts who said the damage didn't occur. The judge didn't expect the people to have forensic detail, didn't expect their evidence to make 100% sense. He gave them credit for being regular lay people, and on balance of probabilities, he believed the homeowner over the experts, which is a really good bit of case law to be aware of. I've had some claims recently where no land payout has been forthcoming despite dwelling damage occurred because I've considered the land damage less than minor. I've been pretty frustrated. I've been trying for about a year to try and get some understanding and more depth around this. Thus far, EQC haven't fronted up. I've had a range of meetings and things, so I don't know where that exactly sits and what that's going to mean for coverage for people in the future. I'm going to persist, and hopefully at some stage EQC will actually answer some questions in detail. Some other useful information, EQC now has a public claims map of historic claims going back to, I think, 1997. Most of them are there. It's geolocating some behind, so there's the odd one that's been missed. Tells you what sort of claim and what when it was. So that's just for claims that have accepted and paid out, but it's a really useful resource for our general work. You can obtain information through Information Act requests for the Earthquake Commission. If you just send them an email or ask, there's a form on their website. And that's really, for the homeowner, you're often acting in a bit of void of information. It'd be really useful to understand full circumstances. If you're challenging, say, a Schedule 3 decline, It's really useful to know the reasons that it have been considered or not. So you can put a request and get the property full file, estimates from engineers, invoices, briefs, everything comes through, and it's really useful to use. The New Zealand Claims Resolution Service has been rolled out, now is available to homeowners for landslips nationwide. It's early days for that service being expanded and rolled out, but I think there's some good hope that that'll be a really benefit to people in the future, and I look forward to seeing them really get up to speed and helping people out, and it gives people another avenue. I think hopefully we can support that as well. Natural hazard insurance bill takes over from the EQC Act next year. From what I could see, I don't think landslips are a key feature of the review and update of the EQC Act, so not a whole lot has changed. The Act does allow settlement by diminution of value, which is a new thing under the Act. It was used quite a lot in Christchurch, I believe. A landslip is now called a landslide. Bridges and retaining walls are no longer insured for the depreciated or the indemnity value. They're now insured for replacement, but to a $50,000 cap limit. One area I have some concern about is it's now a damage period. So for a landslip, the initial damage is a direct result of an earthquake, a flood, hydrothermal activity, a landslip, storm, or tsunami 48 hours after the start time. I have some concerns. For example, Abbotsford landslide did not occur in 48 hours. It occurred over a period of a month or more. And many landslips, many of the worst, most nasty landslips occur much more slowly than 48 hours. I really hope that is interpreted and allowed in a generous manner. I have some concern that if a strict view is taken, it's going to reduce coverage for some of the very worst landslides that affect homes. Hopefully not. And a positive finish. There can be some challenges helping people with their claims, but at the end of the day, you get to work with them to see their homes stabilised. You get to see them, the pressure and the stress lift and relief. You get some very grateful clients. When you get to the end of it, you can tell them their home is stable. And it's a pretty rewarding job to get to that stage as well. So, thank you for sticking with me and listening today. I hope that was of use today, and I welcome some questions if people have them.
Thanks, David. There are a few questions just to pop in there. The first one is, does water supply include water tanks?
Yes. Right, sorry, I flicked through back a lot. Then we look at the definition of a building. Residential, where are we going? Residential building or water supply, drainage, sewage, gas, electrical, telephone services, and put into the structure. So a tank is part of the water supply services, and that is made clear by Schedule 2, property not insured, where it says that property not insured, so any reservoir, swimming pool, bath, tank is not insured other than a water tank forming part of a water supply to a residential building. So that is saying water tank forming part of the supply to a building is covered as an insured service under the building cap.
Very good. Another one here. Could you please discuss whether the EQC's emphasis on either land, e.g. liquefaction, landslide, etc., or buildings, e.g. earthquake resistance, etc., yields a greater financial benefit to the owner?
Yes. I don't quite understand that question, sorry.
Okay, maybe the person who asked that question can email you direct on that one.
Yep.
Can you please tell me whose responsibility it is to provide EQC with an estimate of the cost of the remedial work recommended by the Tonkin Taylor engineer who wrote the recommendation?
So the professional fees aspect is normally in the report. Tonkin Taylor will provide that. The actual cost to complete those works is produced by a cost estimator working for EQC. Often that is the insurance assessor who goes out and sees the property, but sometimes it can be a professional cost estimator, quantity surveyor, other bits and pieces. So it's someone who should be capable of costing those works in detail. And that is obviously those cost estimates sometimes can be brief and basic, and it's sometimes with the customer getting some assistance from an actual builder or contractor to put an alternative estimate together. And one thing, if those things become relevant, doesn't stop a homeowner accepting their settlement based on what's being presented. They can accept that settlement and they can still challenge or request top-ups afterwards, and that can be quite a way in the future. So if a settlement was based on a remedial cost estimate and halfway through building that work, so it went over cost, you can still go back then and ask for that to be topped up at that stage. So challenging an EQC claim is as simple going back with grounds and requesting it be relooked at, and that can happen still quite well into the future.
Another question here. In your experience, in the event that the estimated cost of remediation design is significantly lower than the real-world cost, will EQC adjust their claim for the real-world cost, or is the client likely to be shortchanged?
So if the real-world costs are higher, you can go back to EQC and they'll type the claim up if you've got evidence of that. Obviously, if the payout is based on this is for land, a land value cap, i.e. the land value, then obviously they're not going to top it up because they've hit the limit they're going to pay out on.
Just wondering if it is the homeowner's responsibility to engage an engineer after they have experienced land damage and lodged a claim, or should they rely on EQC to process their claim and have EQC assign an engineer to assess their land damage?
So the homeowner has a responsibility to prove their loss, i.e. show there's damage, but it's the insurer's job to assess that damage, and it shouldn't be suggested otherwise. I've had a couple of people talk to me recently and say that they've talked to the insurer and the insurer said they need to get an engineer to get their claim lodged. That's a load of bollocks. It's the insurer's job to arrange an engineer to go and assess the claim. And indeed, if you do an assessment for a person and send them into the insurer, they don't normally pay much attention to it. They get their own engineer to do it. So it is the insurer's job to have that engineering assessment done, but the homeowner has the option of engaging an engineer like us to give them advice specific and check that assessment is true and correct.
Another question here, is the collapse of sinkholes or TOMO ground subsidence therefore not covered?
Yes, so normally a sinkhole or a TOMO is not covered. A TOMO, if it has occurred suddenly from a storm, could be considered storm flood damage. If there's an event you can relate to, if it's sudden rather than being gradual erosion. So there's some ground there. Likewise, if you have an existing sinkhole and the side of it falls into the sinkhole, you can have a good debate as to whether that is subsidence or if that's actually a landslip occurring into the side of a sinkhole. And certainly there have been situations where landslip payouts have occurred on the side of sinkholes.
Next question is, would timber stairs on a slope be covered separate from the dwelling? I gather that means timber stairs on a slope that are not part of the dwelling. The stairs are separate.
It depends on whether they're considered a structure, an appurtenant structure. So if they could be considered a permanent structure, it's fixed to the ground, it's permanent. Does it serve a purpose appurtenant to the dwelling? It could be. I couldn't give you a straight answer on that stage and tell you where EQC is at on exactly appurtenant structures. It does vary from time and in specific situations.
Yeah. Another question here. So water tank at risk, for example, undercut by the slip, should be included in geotech remedial estimate. Is a separate building claim required here or part of the land claim?
So the water tank is, so you don't have to put in a land claim and a building claim, you just put in one claim, but that settlement is effectively assessed in two parts. So so you can get a bit of a crossover in a situation like that, but the short answer is yes, the water tank needs to be protected as part of that claim, and it should be included as part of that claim because it forms part of the water supply to the dwelling. The remedial solution to that may be to relocate the water tank to another location. It certainly has been, for example, where a site is already constrained and a landslip's damaged the septic field, then, and without that septic field, you can't have the house on site. There's been, that cost to repair that septic field could be, very expensive, include a lot of groundworks to reinstate it. So those things are insured and do need to be included.
Next question is, what is the process that is undertaken if it is deemed that the land is no longer viable for its previous use? For example, homes at Whangarei after flooding earlier this year. That's probably a big question.
So one of the things I pointed out in my submission to the Natural Disaster Insurance Select Committee for that last year is the fact that you can have a house that's red zone, red stickered after an event. but not be considered an imminent risk from a natural disaster event. Those things don't align. So the EQC, its insurance, it responds to actual damage. If there's no actual damage, it doesn't respond. I would have liked to have seen some more alignment to say that if an event occurs and the home can no longer be safely occupied, then they consider some payout and include some more generosity in that situation. But sometimes people can find themselves tough out of luck. We're fortunate that the current government has taken a more proactive approach after the recent events to red zone and pay out on a number of properties. It does seem a bit unfair to a good number of other people I've come across over the years who have similar damage but from one-off events and don't get that opportunity to have it done.
Good. There's quite a few questions. We won't be able to get through them all due to time, but please be aware that all questions will be forwarded through to David to answer individually or collectively. Just maybe one more. What are your thoughts on the average value versus value of area actually lost? There have been several access ways damaged at a cost of greater than $300,000 to repair, but only paid out at approximately $10,000 as the access way was on a block of land greater than 10 hectares.
Yeah,
i.e.
so
paid out the average value of the land.
You have to have a good talk with the valuer there. Generally, probably that 10,000 payout is probably appropriate, and that is the reality of access ways on some of those more rural properties. So there's also a hole in that your access way is not insured when it's outside your legal property boundary, and often people have sometimes a moderate portion of land that goes from their boundary to the actual formed road. The only instance where you could get a much higher value for that area of access way is that if it completely prohibits access to the property, that property then becomes inaccessible and loses its value overall. There have been cases where that has resulted in a much higher payout. That requires some different thinking about the land valuation process that is not normally accepted by EQC currently, I think. I have had some correspondence with EQC about the land valuation stuff that's very much at the limits of my knowledge, but they did suggest that they do still accept alternative valuation mechanisms. So that's something that you really have to talk to a property valuer who really does his know his stuff in the EQC space, which is there's certainly some around. There's one particular I use up here that I talk to when I get into sponsors like that.
Very good. I think that wraps us up for time, but just to reiterate that you can send your questions directly to David at the email that was accompanying the invite, and also on the first slide, and any of these questions that have come through that are not answers will be forwarded through to David to answer as well. So thank you very much for the presentation, David. Thanks to everybody for attending, and with that we'll call it a day. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Michael, and thanks for Surtex for hosting today.